Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the latest of the WSET School London webinars. We are very excited to bring to you tonight the topic of Discover Australian Cabernet with the wonderful Emma Symington MW. Emma's going to get started shortly. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. We do have a Q&A section here for you to ask your questions in. So as we're going through, please do put any questions you may have there. We will review the questions at the end and we'll leave a bit of time for Emma to answer them. If you want to say anything else, please do pop that in the chat. It's always good to know who you are, where you're from, etc. This is being recorded and the recording will be available from tomorrow for anyone who wants to review it. Or share it with friends, family, colleagues, etc. And that's about it from me. So Emma, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julia. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this evening or this morning or afternoon or wherever you are in the world. It's great to be back with you all. I've done a few sessions of these now for WSET School London, looking at various grape varieties and styles from Australia. So I think we've already done Riesling and Shiraz, and we did sparkling wine just before Christmas. So they're all available via the WSET School's YouTube site. You can go and look at those if you haven't already. But today we're focusing on Cabernet Sauvignon, or the so-called king of grape varieties, which I'm really excited about because I think as a grape variety, it's what I think a lot of people have actually fallen out of love with a little bit. I think perhaps that's down to its ubiquity. You know, it is the most planted grape variety in the world these days. And also perhaps because a lot of the wines from regions like Bordeaux and Napa and so on at the top end are just astronomically priced these days. And so, normal people just don't get the chance to taste them. And so I think, people perhaps have fallen a little bit out of love with Cabernet. But my job today is to make you realise how exciting Cabernet Sauvignon can be, and particularly from Australia, because actually I think talking about value in Cabernet Sauvignon, Australia is, one of those places that you can buy regionally distinct Cabernet Sauvignon at, £20 a bottle. And probably even the top examples are no more than £90, £100 a bottle, which I admit is a lot of money. That is very much a special occasion bottle of wine. But when you compare it to the likes of Napa or Bordeaux, their top wines, you're talking significantly more than that. So I do think there's a lot of value to be had from Australia in terms of Cabernet Sauvignon and a lot of, as I say, regionally distinct wines. So if I can just move this on, here we go. I suppose I should introduce myself to any of you who don't know me. So I'm Emma Symington. I'm a Master of Wine and I work for Wine Australia. I'm based here in the UK, but my office in London covers the EMEA markets, so Europe, Middle East and Africa. And I'm the education manager, so I get to go out and talk to people about Australian wine, which is pretty good fun. And I just wanted to point out at this point, before we kind of get into the presentation itself, the website that's on your screen, australianwinediscovered.com. So this is our education resource, our website. We set this up a couple of years ago now, and it really is a one-stop shop for anything you want to know about Australian wine. So particularly for those of you actually studying for WSET exams, it's a really great one to bookmark and go back to, because as I said, there's really everything you could want to know. Now you do have to register to use that website, but it takes 2 seconds literally, and it's free. And once you've done that, all of the resources there are available for you to download and use as you want. So there's currently 25 modules. There are more in progress, but they cover the key regions, the key grape varieties, and then also broader topics like old vines, sparkling wine, alternative grape varieties and so on. So a lot of stuff in there, and within each module there's the study guides, there's PowerPoint presentations you can download and use. So if any of you actually work as educators, it's an amazing resource. There's also of course all the maps, video content, as I said, a lot of information, so a really good one to be aware of if you want to learn a little bit more about Aussie wine. But back to today. So in this session, we'll just do a quick sort of overview of the history of Cabernet Sauvignon in Australia. And then we'll talk a bit broadly about how it's grown and some of the techniques winemakers can use to influence its style. We'll talk a bit about blending, because of course Cabernet Sauvignon, whilst it can be a single varietal wine, so 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, it also is often blended with various different grape varieties. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk at some length at some of the key regions in Australia where Cabernet Sauvignon is grown. We'll look at their climates, the soil types, topographies, and the sort of styles of Cabernet Sauvignon they produce. So that is the plan. Okay, but before we get into that, I always think it's worthwhile sort of setting the scene. And for those of you who've done any of these sessions before, will have seen this map. I love it because I think you can never emphasize enough just how big Australia is. And when we're talking about diversity and styles of wine, be it across, the spectrum, talking about styles in terms of sparkling, still, and so on, or be it in terms of diversity in terms of number of grape varieties, because there's 130 different grape varieties planted in Australia. Also, in terms of talking about the style within a variety, so when we're talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, when you remember that Australia is actually the size of Europe or bigger than Europe, you begin to understand why there is this huge diversity in styles of wines in Australia. So as you can see, although Australia is one country, it very much is a continent-sized country. So always worth remembering that. Now, just to put a little bit of scale on here, if you fly from Perth over in Western Australia across to Sydney, that is a 5-hour flight. You're crossing about 2,000 miles and you're crossing 3 time zones in that time. It's a similar distance from flying to London to Cairo. So, a really, really huge country. So unsurprisingly, when you have a big country, there are a lot of wine regions. In fact, there are 65, all clustered, as you can see, kind of around the southern part of Australia, which of course is the cooler part of Australia. And actually 58 of these regions are planting Cabernet Sauvignon. So it is a very widely planted grape variety in Australia. Okay, so onto Cabernet itself and a bit of history here. Now, the first grapes went over to Australia in 1788. That was with the first fleet. But really, viticulture in Australia didn't kick off until sort of the early 1800s. That's when things really began to take off. And there's one man who's really considered to be the grandfather or father of the Australian wine industry, and he's called James Busby. So he was actually Scottish. He was a horticulturalist and he moved out to Australia in the 1820s. And once he was there, he became interested in viticulture. He then got a job for the Aussie government and was tasked to move back to Europe, or come back to Europe, and spend 6 months traveling the wine regions of France and Spain and also into Italy and collecting cuttings of different grape varieties. I mean, what a tough job that must have been. So in the 6 months, he gathered hundreds and hundreds of different cuttings of grape varieties. They were all packaged up individually and then shipped back with him to Australia, landing in 1832. Once he landed, those cuttings were divided into 2. Half were planted in what is now Sydney's Botanic Gardens. So if any of you have been to Sydney, you know where I mean. And the other half, James planted at his property called Kirkton Park, which is in the Hunter Valley. And from there, those cuttings were then grown on, propagated on. Further cuttings were taken and were sold across Australia to other people who wanted to grow vines. So to this day, if you actually go out to Australia and talk to some growers and winemakers, many of them will talk about having Busby clones or Busby cuttings in their vineyards, in that they can sort of trace that genetic heritage back to these early cuttings that came in with him back in 1832. Now, the reason I say this all is because the first documented Cabernet Sauvignon that came into Australia was with James Busby at that time. And fascinatingly, today, what is believed to be the world's oldest vineyards of Cabernet Sauvignon are actually in Australia. So as you can see here, the oldest vines believed to be in the Barossa Valley, planted in 1886. That's now owned by Penfolds, and it produces their Block 42 Calimna Cabernet Sauvignon. But there's other regions as well, particularly in South Australia, that have some very old Cabernet Sauvignon. Langhorne Creek has a famous vineyard called the Matala Vineyard that was planted in 1891. That also has some Cabernet Sauvignon, still producing grapes to this day. And similarly in the Clare Valley, there's some very old Cabernet Sauvignon there too. So there are these pockets of very, very old vines of Cabernet Sauvignon in Australia, which is, I always think, quite incredible. But despite all this, it took Cabernet quite a long time to really kind of take off in Australia. As you can see here, fast forwarding sort of that's 80 years, by 1966, only 620 tonnes of Cabernet was crushed in Australia. So really not very much at all. But fast forward 50 years from that to 2016, and suddenly 255,000 tonnes of Cabernet were produced. So in that 50-year span, the popularity of Cabernet really boomed. And of course, this wasn't just because of the domestic market, this was the international market. It, was at the same time as exports were booming and people wanted Cabernet Sauvignon. So more and more was planted, more and more was produced, more and more was bottled and sold. And today it's actually the third most planted grape variety in Australia after Shiraz and Chardonnay. So it's the second most planted red grape variety overall. So it really is a very important grape variety in Australia. And as I said, planted in 58 different wine regions. But looking a bit more broadly, before we look at the wine regions themselves, so viticulture, how Cabernet Sauvignon is grown. So as you may be aware, Cabernet Sauvignon is actually a crossing, and it originated in Bordeaux. So its parents are Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. So no surprising, given that it originated in Bordeaux, it really likes a maritime climate and that kind of moderate climate, I suppose. I always think of it as a Goldilocks grape variety. It doesn't like too hot type temperatures. If it gets too hot, Cabernet Sauvignon tends to get quite cooked in terms of flavour. It loses that lovely precision, which is what we really like from Cabernet Sauvignon. But similarly, if it's too cold a climate, you tend to get lots and lots of really green flavours in it. Now, Cabernet as a grape variety does tend to have a herbaceous edge, and that's what gives it a lovely lift. But if it gets too cold, you get into the really green flavours, kind of stalky and very astringent tannins. So it doesn't like anything too hot, doesn't like anything too cold. It just likes that lovely Goldilocks kind of just right, moderate to warm in terms of temperature, and really does like that maritime influence. So you can see a bunch of Cabernet Sauvignon here. As a grape variety, it tends to have quite small berries, and as you can see, they all have this kind of lovely bluish tinge. It is a very thick-skinned grape variety, which is why you get a lot of tannin from Cabernet Sauvignon, but it also means it's quite disease resistant. So although it does tend to prefer relatively dry climates, not drought, it doesn't like drought, but relatively dry, but it can cope actually pretty well in humid climates as well because of those nice thick skins. Now, as a grape variety, it does have the tendency to overcrop or can yield quite high. So viticulturists always have to be quite careful in the vineyard to manage their pruning to make sure that limiting their yield, I suppose. Because if you have too much crop, then you tend to just lose the definition of flavour. Things get a little bit more dilute, and it's just, you certainly won't get any premium style wine from it. So managing the yield is very important in terms of viticulture. And then in terms of soil type, and this again shouldn't be a surprise when you remember where Cabernet comes from in the Bordeaux. It has quite gravelly soils on the left bank, and Cabernet Sauvignon as a vine is one that really likes free draining soils. I think the phrase often is it doesn't like getting its feet wet, so it really doesn't like waterlogged soils. So anything like clay and so on really doesn't suit Cabernet Sauvignon. Anything free draining though is absolutely what it suits best. And then when we turn to winemaking, I think a lot of winemakers really like Cabernet Sauvignon because as a grape variety, there's a lot of opportunity for winemakers to make different decisions in terms of the winemaking to really influence the final style of wine they make. So we're just going to quickly give a brief overview of some of these. So in terms of fermentation, typically Cabernet Sauvignon is 100% destemmed. Because as a grape variety, it does have that herbaceous edge, so you don't really need to add any more of those kind of herbaceous notes you often get if you're having a bit of stem contact. Having said that, I was just talking to a winemaker in Coonawarra, and she was telling me about a new Cabernet Sauvignon they've been making, which is 100% whole bunch, which is not necessarily what you'd think about with Cabernet Sauvignon, but they've made it in this style because it's meant to be, super easy drinking, released early, no oak or any of that lot, and it is 100% whole bunch. So as ever, most things are typically destemmed, but it doesn't mean they all are. Maceration, obviously, an element the winemaker, again, has a lot of opportunity to make different decisions. So this is all about how much the skins are in contact with the juice during fermentation and how they manage that. Whether they're punching down, whether they're pumping over, if they're doing rack or return, and how often they do that. And then even at the end of fermentation, whether the skins are left, for even longer in contact with the wine. All of these different options are going to influence the style of wine that's produced at the end, and particularly the texture. This all has quite a lot of influence on the tannins. Oak maturation, of course, is a big decision, something winemakers consider quite a lot when it comes to Cabernet Sauvignon, because as a grape variety, it's one that can really cope with quite a lot of oak, both in terms of quite a lot of new oak, soaks up new oak really well, but also it's a grape variety that can stay in oak for quite a long time. A year, 2 years is not unusual. And this is because Cabernet Sauvignon, as I said, has quite thick skins, so has a lot of tannin. So as a grape variety, it tends to be very structured. And so when you have this lengthy time in oak before bottling, it helps to polymerize some of those tannins, so smoothing them out, so you get a slightly more supple texture, and it means the wines are essentially a little bit more easy to drink. So the winemaker can decide how long the wine is in oak for and what style of oak it is, if it's French or American or Hungarian or otherwise. And of course, then if they're using new oak or older oak, all of these are going to give different characteristics to the wine. And then finally, bottling and aging. Some wineries, if they're lucky and they're not talking to their accountants too much, might be able to bottle their wine and then age it in their cellars before they release it to the customers. Some may not be able to do that. But I think the joy about Cabernet Sauvignon, and particularly premium examples of Cabernet Sauvignon, is these wines are built to last decades, 10, 20, 30 years tops, because of all that tannin and because there's generally quite a lot of acidity in Cabernet Sauvignon. Plus, you always have this lovely core of concentrated fruit when you're talking about premium examples. So these are wines that are really, really made for the long term. And again, that's something that can help winemakers' decision making in the winemaking process. So blending. And this really is another big decision winemakers have, whether to produce a single varietal, so 100% Cabernet Sauvignon wine, or whether to blend it. And if so, what to blend it with. So you may have heard of Cabernet Sauvignon often being called a donut grape variety, or saying it's got a hole in the middle. And that's really because Cabernet Sauvignon, when you taste it, quite often you sort of hit up front with quite a lot of concentration of fruit. So, lots of that cassis kind of character. And the wine almost sort of leaps along your tongue. So you get that fruit up front, and then you get a lot of tannin. But there's nothing in the mid palate to kind of glue those two things together. So this is why people talk about this hole in Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, of course, as we know in Bordeaux, what often happens is you're blending with Merlot and to a lesser extent, things like Cabernet Franc, Malbec and Petit Verdot. But Merlot as a grape variety tends to be much fleshier than Cabernet Sauvignon. So not as sort of structured and austere, a little bit, let's say, prettier, happier, but certainly fleshier, so more of that kind of fruit core. So the Merlot then kind of fills the whole of that Cabernet Sauvignon. That is the idea anyway. And we see this in Australia too, particularly in regions like Margaret River. You often get a lot of these Bordeaux style blends with things like Merlot being blended in. And we're increasingly seeing like quite a lot of Malbec actually. But I think the classic Australian blend, or what is known as the Great Australian Blend, is actually blending Shiraz with Cabernet Sauvignon. Because back in the mid-1900s, people were playing around with Cabernet Sauvignon and wanting to blend it with something. But at the time, there was basically no Merlot in Australia. But what, of course, they had lots of was Shiraz. And Shiraz actually has many similarities to Merlot in terms of that fleshy core, that lovely fruit richness. So blending it with Cabernet Sauvignon filled exactly the same hole, if you like. So, you had that lovely, you ended up with that sort of Intensity of fruit from the Cabernet Sauvignon, then that rich middle from the Shiraz, and then the tannin from the Cabernet bringing it all together. So Cabernet Shiraz or Shiraz Cabernet is a really classic Australian blend. And it's something you see across Australia. But interestingly, you actually see it also across regions. So quite often you might get Shiraz from the Barossa, say. So, you know, quite a rich, full-bodied, voluptuous style of Shiraz. And the Cabernet might come from Coonawarra, which tends to be a more restrained style of Cabernet. So you're getting that sort of fruit core and richness from Shiraz, but the structure from the Coonawarra Cabernet, and blending them together makes a really beautiful whole. So if you haven't tried any Aussie Cab Shiraz, I'd certainly recommend you do so, because they really are quite beautiful wines. Okay, so looking at Australia specifically, as I said, there are 58 wine regions in Australia that are producing Cabernet Sauvignon, but we definitely don't have time to talk through them all. This is just a snapshot of some of the really most important regions in Australia for Cabernet Sauvignon. But actually tonight, I'm just going to focus on 3 of them. So we're going to look at Margaret River over in Western Australia, Coonawarra in South Australia, and the Yarra Valley in Victoria, which might be a surprise to some of you, because I think it's not necessarily thought of as a Cabernet Sauvignon region, even though historically, actually, that's where it started. And then I'll just wrap up at the end with some of these other South Australian regions. So kicking off with Coonawarra in South Australia. So as you can see, Coonawarra is down in the southern part of South Australia, in part of South Australia called the Limestone Coast, which should give you a little bit of a clue as to the soil type you have there. So I've included a few of these maps as we go through the different regions, because I think they're fascinating. So this is taken from our Gaia imaging that we did. So this is remote satellite imaging. We did a couple of years ago now. And essentially this is overlaying the regional boundaries on the satellite map, but particularly it's picking out where the vineyards are. So all of these dark green areas you can see, this is actually where the vineyards are in the region. And you can see in Coonawarra, although, you know, at times the region is quite wide, west to east, actually the majority, the vast majority of the vineyards are in this kind of lozenge shape, which runs down the center of the region and actually kind of runs down that highway you should just be about able to pick out from Glenroy in the north down to Penola in the south. And as you can see, that part of land is really basically a monoculture. It really is all viticulture, all vineyards, and predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon. And this is because this part of Coonawarra is where you get terra rossa soil, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, the interesting thing to me, or one of the interesting things to me about Coonawarra, is what it says here about climate, maritime. Now, you might think back a couple of slides and go, hang on, that looks quite a long way inland. How is that possibly a maritime climate? And you're not wrong, it is quite a long way inland. It's about 100 kilometres inland. Now, usually when we talk about maritime influence, we might say it extends up to about 50k inland, something like that. Here, as I just said, we're 100k inland. So how on earth is there a maritime influence here? Well, there is, and it's partly because of this. As you can see, it is flat. It is dead flat. So this is a view across Coonawarra. As you can see, I said it's mostly a monoculture. You know, it is all vineyards. You can pick out that highway that's running down the region. But the important thing is here, it is so flat. And this flatness, if you like, lack of topography, extends all the way to the coast. So there are literally no hills, no ridges, no nothing to stop these ocean breezes coming inland. So this is why you have a maritime influence, even though you are quite a long way inland. And the other reason really is because of something called the Bonnie upwelling. Now, the Bonnie upwelling, clues in the name, it's a upwelling of very, very cold water that comes from deep down in the Southern Ocean. And remembering the Southern Ocean is a cold ocean anyway, because all the water comes up from Antarctica. So really, really cold water, and it comes off just off the coast. And that's what's shown in this little map here. So this is a map of ocean temperature taken, as you can see, off the coast of South Australia and running into Victoria. So if you look off Adelaide, for example, the water temperatures there are balmy 21 degrees. I mean, that would be lovely to go for a swim in, wouldn't it? But as soon as you come down to the coast off Coonawarra, you're dropping down to 13, 12 degrees. Huge difference in temperature. As you can see, it's just off the coast. So this has a really important moderating influence across this southern part of South Australia. And this is also exacerbated because the prevailing winds here are westerlies. So they're coming from the west. So they literally run right across this cold water, cooling that weather pattern, and then that runs onto the land. So this is a really important system that cools that whole part of the coastline, including Coonawarra. And this upwelling runs every year. You know, the locals basically can predict it. It starts in about November time, remembering we're in the southern hemisphere, so that's the start of the growing season, and it runs for 7 months. So essentially it runs for the entirety of the growing season down there. So this is acting to cool the temperatures, particularly cooling the nighttime temperatures, extending the growing season. And this is why you have that maritime influence in Coonawarra. Now, the other special thing about Coonawarra that I touched on at the beginning is the soil. And Coonawarra, I think, in terms of Australian regions, is quite unusual because, well, particularly where the vineyards are, is essentially one soil. It doesn't have the diversity in terms of soils that a lot of regions in Australia do. But this soil is very special. This is terra rossa, so iron-rich topsoil. As you can see, it's this bright red dirt over a base of limestone. And limestone is free draining. And as I said earlier, Cabernet Sauvignon loves free draining soils. So this is absolutely perfect for Cabernet Sauvignon. And then below that limestone sits the water table. So Coonawarra as a region, in the winter is cold and wet, so it fills up that water table. The summers are pretty dry, but the vines can always access the water by going via through the free draining limestone. So it's a really beautiful region in terms of it's just that perfect combination of place and soil and climate and variety. The two things, Cabernet Sauvignon and Coonawarra, just go together so well. So having said all that, what does this mean for the style of Cabernet Sauvignon coming out of Coonawarra? Well, it might give you a clue if I tell you that back in the sort of mid-late 1900s, it used to be called, or labelled as, in fact, Coonawarra Claret. So that should give you a clue. This is always quite a restrained style of Cabernet Sauvignon. It is in no way a fruit bomb. It's actually much more savoury in style. So you tend to get a core of black fruit, but around that you get much more savoury, earthy, and kind of black olive flavours coming through as well. Always medium bodied, always quite structured. These are wines that really are built for the long term. And they're really, really lovely wines to have. And as I said earlier, you know, some of these wines that you can buy, things like Wynn's Black Label, for example, retails at about 20 quid a bottle over here. And it is just an incredible wine. And that still, at that price point, is a wine that will age for 10, 20, 30 years quite easily. So if any of you haven't tried any of these Coonawarra Cabernets, I really would recommend you give them a go because they are beautiful wines. Okay. So region number 2, across to Margaret River. So we've taken what, about a 1,500-mile flight west at this point, right across to Western Australia to Margaret River. Now Coonawarra, we were just talking about, is quite a historic region. You know, the first vineyards there were planted in the 1800s. Margaret River, on the other hand, is actually a very modern wine region. First planted in 1967. So this year is its 55th anniversary of those first plantings. And it was really planted because of its possibility, really, for growing top Cabernet Sauvignon. So there was an academic called Dr. John Gladstones, and he did some research in Margaret River and really recommended that people start planting Cabernet Sauvignon because of its similarity to Bordeaux. Climatically wise, Bordeaux in a warm vintage, but very similar to Bordeaux in a warm vintage. And also in terms of soil type, because Margaret River generally has very gravelly soils. So again, very free draining, which, as we know, Cabernet Sauvignon likes. So he recommended people start planting Cabernet Sauvignon. And they did, as I said, the first plantings were in 1967. And it really didn't take very long for, I think, people around the world to sort of cotton on to Margaret River. And, you know, some of these wines now are really the best Cabernets coming out of Australia. So in a very short amount of time, it's really kind of made its mark on the global wine map. And of course, makes some amazing Chardonnay as well. So looking at the satellite imaging, you can see there's quite a sort of sprinkling of vineyards across Margaret River with that very straight boundary on the eastern side. That was actually drawn by Dr. John Gladstone's, you know, that straight line with a ruler defining the region. Now Margaret River obviously is a peninsula, so surrounded on three sides by the ocean. Off the southern side, you have the Southern Ocean. So that is that cold ocean I was mentioning earlier. But the western side and the northern side, that's actually the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is a warm ocean. So this has quite an important moderating impact on the temperature in Margaret River. The result of which is that Margaret River has a very low diurnal variation. So it doesn't get very hot in the daytime. Well, by Australian standards, I suppose, you know, in the summer, you know, 30, 32, but it also doesn't get very cold at night. So, you know, it's not going to drop more than 10 degrees, say. And there's also a very even heat accumulation over the year. So essentially, it's just a very lovely, balmy temperature in Margaret River all year round. And it is a beautiful place for growing grapes because of that. Lovely even temperature accumulation, but they do have every afternoon throughout the summer these lovely westerly ocean breezes coming across the region. They actually call it the air conditioner in the region because it comes every afternoon cooling the temperatures in those vineyards. So again, this ocean maritime influence really asserting itself. So climatically, as I said, sort of Mediterranean climate, but this strong maritime influence is very important in the Margaret River. Altitude is not playing a part in terms of having a cooling influence, but there is a ridge that runs sort of north to south, almost down the middle of the region. And although that's not giving a big influence in terms of elevation and cooling, what it does mean is any vineyards on the eastern side of that ridge are going to be much warmer because they don't get this moderating breezes, this air conditioner coming off the ocean. So soil type in Margaret River, as I said, is predominantly a lot of gravel. And, you know, as we know from earlier, Cabernet Sauvignon really likes that sort of soil type. That's free draining soils, very similar to what you see in Bordeaux on the left bank. So this again is why Dr. John Gladstone's recommended people stop planting Cabernet Sauvignon in the Margaret River. Oh, and this was just to give you a lovely view across Margaret River, just to show how important the ocean is in terms of, I suppose, the personality of the region. It is a beautiful region if you ever get the chance to go out there. And happily, Western Australia has reopened its borders now. So it is, in fact, possible to get there again. So what does this all mean in terms of style for Margaret River Cabernet? Well, firstly, it is very different to Coonawarra Cabernet. I'd say if you had a glass of each side by side, the differences would be very, very obvious. On the one hand, you've got Coonawarra Cabernet, which, as I said, is quite medium bodied, quite restrained, more savoury, but very structured. Margaret River, on the other hand, to me, always has this kind of lovely plushness and texture to it. It tends to have a lovely fruit core, you know, lots of cassis, those kind of real fresh, fragrant fruit, but a lovely plush texture, almost like this real fine-grained tannins. So quite different to the more structured tannins that you see in Coonawarra. And you tend to get this lovely kind of perfume lift from Margaret River Cabernet as well. It always leaps out the glass. Really, really beautiful wines. And then finally, Yarra Valley. Now, it's probably, as I said earlier, probably might come as a bit of a surprise to many of you that I've included this as the third region, because I think for many people, and understandably so, this is a region which is Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. You know, that is what it is known for. And I wouldn't disagree with you. There's some incredible Chardonnay and Pinot Noir coming out of the Yarra Valley. But historically, it's actually a region that really started on Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, Cabernet only accounts for about 6% of plantings there now. So, you know, Chardonnay and Pinot are very much the dominant varieties. But I do think there's still some incredible Cabernet Sauvignon produced in the Yarra Valley. And again, regionally distinct, very different to Coonawarra, very different to Margaret River, and worth seeking out if you get a chance. So we're back in Victoria. We're in Victoria now, I should say. So we've flown back east again. Yarra Valley is about 45 minutes to an hour's drive out of Melbourne, depending on the traffic. And it was the first region planted in Victoria back in 1838. But by the turn of the century, so early 1900s, viticulture actually totally ceased in the Yarra Valley for a combination of all sorts of economic reasons. And it wasn't until the 1970s that things started again and people started replanting. So I always think it's quite interesting because although on the one hand it is a very historic region, on the other it's basically as modern as Margaret River is. So it's kind of got this dual personality, if you like. So looking at the satellite imaging, again, you can see there's quite a sprinkling of vineyards across the region. But the key factor in Yarra Valley is there is this huge difference in altitude, anything from about 30 meters down on the valley floor up to 400 and plus meters up in the upper Yarra. So the Yarra Valley is generally split into two subregions or unofficial subregions, the lower Yarra and the upper Yarra. And this is referring essentially to downstream of the Yarra Valley, the Yarra River and upstream of it. But an easy way to look at it is if you can follow the highway, you can hopefully just about pick out on this map that runs from northeast to southwest. So starting in Fernshaw and running southwest down through Lilydale, everything north and west of that is the lower Yarra. So lower lying vineyards, this is the warmer sites in the Yarra Valley. Everything south and east of there is the upper Yarra. So this is where, you know, vineyards can get very, very high. And this is where you get a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir grown these days. But Cabernet, unsurprisingly, because this is a cool climate region, it does need to be planted in those warmer sites. So it really very much is down on those lower lying sites on the Yarra Valley floor in the lower Yarra. So as a region, it does have this sort of dual personality in terms of climate, because on the one hand, it does show quite a lot of continentality, but on the other hand, it does actually have some maritime influence. Because if you look at this map, you can see we're not too far inland, but importantly, there's hills that encircle the valley from the north, from the east, and from the south. And when these westerlies, which again is the prevailing wind, come in, I'm blowing across Port Phillip Bay, they blow into the Yarra Valley and then kind of get trapped. So that cold air that's coming in with these westerlies gets trapped in the valley. So again, it's bringing that maritime influence and that cooling influence off the ocean. As I said, there is this huge variation in terms of altitude in the Yarra Valley, which is why you do get Chardonnay and Pinot grown there and sparkling wine produced from them as well as table wine. But you also, on the other hand, do get Cabernet Sauvignon planted there. And this is just a view across the Yarra Valley. Obviously, this was spring when this was taken. You can see the buds, the first leaves forming there. It is a beautiful region if any of you get the chance to go out there with those sort of big hills surrounding. It's a lovely place to go. So in terms of Cabernet Sauvignon in the Yarra Valley, again, it's got its own little sort of distinct character, which is quite different to Coonawarra and quite different to Margaret River. It is a cool climate, the Yarra Valley. So no surprising, you tend to get quite a lot of tannin from Yarra Valley Cabernet. And you also always tend to get this lovely herbal lift going through there. So it's not that, you know, green, astringent note if Cabernet was grown in too cold a climate, but that lovely herbaceous lift just for me always adds this kind of aromatic feeling to Yarra Valley Cabernet, which kind of sets it apart from Margaret River or Coonawarra. It is, you know, some absolutely incredible wines produced there. Sadly, not many of them though. So just a quick overview of the rest of the key regions producing Cabernet in South Australia. So we've got McLaren Vale, just south of Adelaide. Now this is very much a Mediterranean climate in McLaren Vale, so you do tend to get much sort of fuller, richer bodied styles of Cabernet produced there. Langhorne Creek, I think I mentioned up front, because it does have some very, very old Cabernet Sauvignon grown there. Again, is a warmer region, so you do get this more full-bodied sort of voluptuous style of Cabernet, and actually that's a region you do get a lot of Cabernet Shiraz blends produced. Eden Valley, for those of you who don't know, abuts the Barossa Valley, and it's not a valley, it's actually an elevated plateau sitting at about 400 meters in terms of altitude, so it's cooler, what I'm saying, than the Barossa Valley floor. So the Cabernet Sauvignon you get from Eden Valley and Henschke Make a Beautiful One, for example, always tends to be quite restrained, certainly more so than anything you'd find from the Barossa Valley, for example. And then up in the Clare Valley, again, you get a bit of Cabernet up there. And again, it tends to be this sort of fuller bodied, richer style. So quite different from what we've been talking about in terms of Coonawarra, in terms of Yarra Valley, and in terms of Margaret River. And that's really, I think, everything I wanted to cover in terms of Cabernet Sauvignon. But just a quick recap, if you want to learn more about Australian wine, do head to Australian Wine Discovered. There is everything you could possibly want to learn more. And I will open up to any questions. Julia.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Emma. What a wonderful trip around the different styles of Cabernet Sauvignon from Australia. I'm just having a little look at the Q&A. Give people a couple of minutes to think up and type in their questions if they have them. We do have one here to start with. Do they have issues achieving vine dormancy in Margaret River because it's so warm through the year and day to night?
Great question. As far as I know, they don't, no, but it is definitely warmer there in winter than the other regions I've been talking about. But I don't think dormancy has ever been an issue in Margaret River, as far as I'm aware.
Good to know. I have a question for you.
Sure thing.
Just having thought about talking about Cabernet Sauvignon and the comparisons to Bordeaux, we know that Bordeaux has been experimenting with other grape varieties recently because of climate change. Is there anything similar happening in Australia? Is there any risk for Cabernet Sauvignon? Good
question. I mean, climate change is something that is always front of mind, I'd say, for viticulturists in Australia and frankly globally, as we know. And yeah, I mean, it's something that people are very much working to avoid or manage or best manage. Certainly we're seeing in Australia a lot of people experimenting with other grape varieties, the so-called alternative grape varieties. So particularly things from southern Italy and Spain and so on, grapes that tend to be quite drought resistant particularly and so on. I think in terms of Cabernet Sauvignon, the regions I've covered today, at the minute it's fine because, you know, they are those more moderate regions and it's still suited well. I'd say in some of those warmer regions I recapped at the end, we may see, you know, in the near future Cabernet dropping out of favour and other varieties being planted. Take McLaren Vale, for example, you know, there's a lot of experimentation there at the minute with things like Nero d'Avola, things like Fiana and Vermentino, you know, these grape varieties which really are drought resistant and are better suited, frankly, to that Mediterranean climate than perhaps something like Cabernet Sauvignon, which, as we know, is more of a maritime climate, prefers that moderate Goldilocks zone in terms of heat. So I think we will see different regions coping with it differently, I suppose, depending on their exact climates, but definitely focusing more for Cabernet on those more moderate climates for sure.
Cool, very good to know, thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in, so I'm going to keep going if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So next, given Cab is grown in so many regions, how does an average consumer know how to choose a quality producer?
Oh, good question. I'd say firstly, go and talk to your local independent wine merchants. I mean, there is nothing better than literally talking to the people who are selling the wine, because they know what their range is. They'll be able to point you in the right direction. Yeah, that's probably honestly the best advice I could give you. I'd say in terms of Cabernet, even at this lower end, I was talking sort of, if you're looking for proper premium regionally distinct wines, £20 a bottle, you're unlikely to be buying that in a supermarket anyway, or even really majestic. So you probably are going to go to your independent wine merchant to seek these things out. So yeah, just have a chat to the staff there.
Lovely. And a sort of a follow on from that, or I guess a similar vein, is, are you able to suggest a wine from each of the 3 key regions that you mentioned, or is that too much of a chat?
Oh, I could probably list hundreds from each of them. Well, not quite that many, but tens definitely. But just quickly, Coonawarra, honestly, I think you can't go wrong with Wynn's Black Label. I mean, Wynn's is probably the key producer in Coonawarra, making incredible wines, but their Black Label, which is their entry-level wine, is just phenomenal. They've been making it for 50 years, and I have luckily had the opportunity to taste some of these wines with some serious age on, and they really do stand up. And I think for value, bang for buck, those are incredible. Margaret River, Vas Felix have some absolutely amazing wines, and again, their entry-level wines are very, very affordable, but really do age nicely. I had a bottle of just the standard Cabernet Sauvignon, which again is about £20 a bottle. I had a bottle of their 2012 a couple of weeks ago, so 10 years old, and it was really drinking so nicely, but obviously still had life ahead of it. And I think it is always quite amazing when you can get a wine at that price, but know you have this longevity. Yarra Valley is a bit trickier because you are going up a price point, I think, always with Cabernet in the Yarra, because there's not a lot grown there, also because it is cooler climate, so it is harder to produce. But things like the likes of Yarra Yering, they make some amazing wines. Mount Mary, for anyone who can afford it. I mean, that really is going up a price point. That's more like £70 a bottle, but the quintet from Mount Mary, so that's using all 5 of the Bordeaux grape varieties, but Cabernet dominant, is really an incredible wine.
All right, I hope everyone's got their shopping lists. It's a good list, thank you. Okay, next. Is Australia looking for new export markets because of the issues with China?
Of course. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm sure you're all aware what's happened with China and the tariffs with Australia. It was a huge blow to the industry, huge blow to many growers and wineries, and of course they need to look for new markets now. Absolutely.
So let's get more over here. I think that's a good plan. Another question here, are there any distinctive Cabernet Sauvignon clones particular to Australia?
Really good question. And yes, and if we'd have had more time, I could have got into this in more detail. But certainly, particularly in Margaret River, they have a very specific clone over there, which really is typical for Margaret River. It's called the Horton clone. And this is also part of the reason, along with the climate that I was talking about, that Margaret River Cabernet always has this lovely fine tannin and kind of plushness. It's partly to the climate, but also partly because of this particular clone. It's quite different to the clones that are grown in South Australia, for example.
Excellent. I've got a question here, which I think I asked you many years ago, so I'm excited to see it come up again. I've heard eucalyptus trees affect vineyards in Australia, giving aromas in the wines. How much of a thing is this relating to Cabernet Sauvignon, and where is it prominent?
It absolutely can be, yeah. And it's not so much the leaves themselves, but it's the oils that you can get off the leaves. And yeah, I know there's been research done, I think actually in Margaret River, when they had, a vineyard with the lines, the vine vineyard lines. And at one side of the vineyard was a row of eucalyptus trees. And they vinified each row separately to sort of see the impact, I suppose, of the eucalyptol on the wine. And it was staggering. Obviously the vines closer to the eucalyptus had a lot of those kind of minty flavors, that eucalypt flavor in the wine, and those further away got far, far less. So yes, it does play a part in some regions which has a lot of eucalypt, but it also depends on the vineyards, because even in regions like Margaret River, where there's a lot of eucalypt trees, I wouldn't say many Cabernet Sauvignons have a huge amount of that eucalypt flavour. So it just depends where the vineyards are, in relation to the trees. But I'd say if you're asking for regions where you often get that eucalypt character, Langhorne Creek, I see quite a lot of it, Clare Valley as well, particularly. You see a bit else other places too.
Lovely, thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more. We have one here asking about organic or biodynamic vineyards, low intervention wineries in the regions that you were talking about. Is there a good proportion of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I think, as we're seeing globally, it's becoming more and more important in Australia in terms of working organically and biodynamically. And in regions like Margaret River, for example, which, because of its beautiful climate and because it gets these ocean breezes through, it has got such low disease pressure, it's very, very easy to work organically or biodynamically. And so in those kind of regions there, and also in places like McLaren Vale, we're seeing a lot of people moving across to working organically, and sustainability on a, I suppose, broader picture thing is becoming very important in the country, and we're seeing many growers kind of moving that way.
Excellent. Winemaking question for you next. Do Australian winemakers favour French or American oak, or does this depend on the wine region or winemaker?
Yes, and yes. I would say absolutely it depends on the winemaker, because ultimately it's a winemaker's decision what to use, but it really depends on the variety as well. For example, things like Cabernet Sauvignon is pretty much, as far as I'm aware, all French oak, unless they're using Hungarian or another European oak. Very little, if any, American. And that's really because Cabernet Sauvignon just doesn't suit that style of oak. It needs something a little bit more savoury. Shiraz, on the other hand, and this is more historically really in the Barossa, was always classically aged in American oak, because that kind of coconutty flavour worked really well with the kind of full-bodied, intense style of Shiraz. And I'm talking now in probably the 1990s, when you had these real blockbuster wines. Because having said that, a lot of people are pulling away from American oak now with Barossa Shiraz, and moving back to French, and also moving away from so much new oak. So there has been quite this change, I think, for a lot of winemakers in terms of what they're using in terms of oak, where it comes from, but also how old it is. Kind of, rather than letting so much oak shine through in the wines, a lot of people are pulling away from that and just letting the fruit show through.
Lovely, thank you. And then a couple of people have been asking for tips on blind tasting. How can you tell Australian wines from other countries like not just Bordeaux, but California as well? Have you got any tips there, anything that you would be looking for?
Well, the first thing I would say is, in my opinion, there's no such thing as Australian wine. And I hate to say it, but again, it's coming back to what I said at the beginning with, the huge size of Australia and the diversity of styles. I think it's very, very hard to ever say, this is Australian because it tastes like X, or it is this. Whereas if you talk to a region, you can make that distinction much more easily, because then you're talking about, a particular limited place. If we're looking at Cabernet, for example, for me, most Napa Cabernets always has this kind of glossiness to the texture. And I think it's to do with how they use their oak. And also they tend to be, generally, more alcoholic and a little bit richer in terms of fruit. So for me, that is the classic Napa style. I'm aware, of course, there's many variations within that. But as a broad brush, it for me is always that kind of glossiness and plushness to the fruit, which I think is quite different to any of the Cabernets you'll see in Australia. And then, of course, Bordeaux, I think you can see some similarities between some Bordeaux's and perhaps more Coonawarra because of that restraint and that more savoury element. It's really tricky. And the best way, honestly, to do any of this is to get yourself, if you can afford it, a load of bottles, open them all up, taste them side by side. Don't even do it blind at first. Just literally go, okay, this is a Coonawarra. What am I smelling? What am I tasting? This is a Napa. What am I smelling? What am I tasting? And the more you can compare and contrast at the same time, you'll see those differences. Whereas if you're trying a Coonawarra one week and a Napa the next week, it's harder to compare. You really need to do it side by side.
That is very useful and very good tips there, I think, for anyone who's embarking on some blind tasting. Lovely. Well, I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. So I will just end by saying thank you once again. It really has been really interesting, and thank you for taking the time to answer the questions as well. I think actually everyone will be really pleased with your answers there too.
No worries at all. It's been lovely joining you, and thank you for having me again.
Anytime. In fact, I think you're back again in the not too distant future.
Yes, actually, I suppose I should have done a plug for that, shouldn't I? Yeah, I forget what date in May. Sometime in May, we're doing one on Australian Chardonnay, but I'm sure Julia and the school will let you all know about that beforehand.
We will indeed. All right, we'll end the recording here.